Thank you so much, Daniela, and thank you everyone for joining today. As Daniela mentioned, this is the update to the Transportation Annual Technology Baseline. And I'm delighted to present on behalf of our entire team. The co-authors are listed here, and specific roles of these co-authors are shown here. Many of the co-authors are with us today and will be happy to address your questions about their areas of responsibility directly. I'd like to especially acknowledge that Argonne National Laboratory has partnered with the National Renewable Energy Lab to develop the content and data for this website. And many of the Argonne team are here with us today and can answer your questions as well. On the agenda for today, I'll address the motivation for the ATB, the project overview, provide a demonstration of the website, and then open it up for questions and comments. Please don't hesitate, as Daniela mentioned, to use the Q&A to ask questions throughout, and the team will be answering those as possible. And then we'll also come online during the Q&A period to address questions. So first of all, why the ATB? What's our motivation here? We are interested in addressing the rapid pace of technology development to provide all of you with credible, current, consistent information in one place on transportation and fuels and vehicles technologies. So we're hoping that this product aids understanding of technology cost and performance across energy sectors, and this particular part of the ATB informs transportation sector analysis for the United States. The Annual Technology Baseline website does have the two parts that are shown here in the image, and we'll be talking today just about the transportation part. So the ATB is used for analysis internally to the Department of Energy's Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Office, as well as by third-party analysts, such as many of the participants in today's webinar, who may want to use these same sets of assumptions for their own purposes. With that brief intro, I'll now turn to the ATB project overview. And as we dive into this, I think it's important to kind of level set as to what the ATB is and what it is not. So it is a website with summary data sets of cost and performance estimates for selected vehicles and fuels. Importantly, it's also a portal for a really key set of other resources, other websites, other publications, can all be identified through the ATB. And these are the resources that the National Lab team has identified as some of the most important ones for transportation analysis. So if you can't find it on the ATB itself, you may wish to pursue some of those other resources that are all listed in the references, cited in the documentation, and often linked directly from the documentation. The ATB also provides a set of scenarios to highlight different levels of optimism around technological improvements. And it enables interactive exploration of many of the data sets, either directly on the website or through the data downloads. Importantly, ATB is not a primary analysis, a model, or in any sense, an all-encompassing future set of scenarios. So in the transportation ATB, we provide key vehicles and fuels data. And we do this by using a set of inputs shown kind of in the middle that rely on assumptions about vehicle cost components and fuel and blend stock pathway cost components, as well as performance for both of those. What we take into the ATB from our references are the set of inputs shown in the middle around modeled vehicle price, fuel economy, emissions by fuel, fuel costs. And then we also take in some assumptions around discount rate and VMT, vehicle miles traveled, and lifetime of vehicles in order to enable a calculation of a levelized cost of driving and emissions at the vehicle level, which takes into account both the vehicle and the fuel assumptions. So this is the overall flow of information within the ATB. The pieces that are new in this update include both the addition of medium and heavy duty vehicles, long haul, box truck, and step van, as well as the addition of classes of light duty vehicle powertrains beyond the midsize. We also have added a number of fuels, especially for sustainable aviation fuel, with ethanol to jet, Fischer-Tropsch, and hydroprocessed esters and fatty acids, as well as the diesel pathways that correspond to the FT and HEFA pathways. So importantly, this all comes from a number of key sources. Argonne's annual autonomy modeling is critical to this product, and we are fortunate to have Ehsan Islam on the line who can help answer questions that may dive into details of how the autonomy modeling produced the modeled vehicle price and fuel economy assumptions. We also have fuel cost assumptions from a variety of sources with many of the experts on those here on the line, as well as fuel emissions from Argonne's GREET model, and we have several GREET modelers on the line as well. A variety of other assumptions that were essential for the calculations are included, and we have folks here who can speak to those. So if you have questions about sources, we have with us many of the experts on these here today to answer those. So please don't hesitate to dive in. In terms of the transportation ATB, the core data that we present are shown here from fuel economy, vehicle price, fuel cost, emissions, both well to tank and well to wheels, as well as financing assumption and that levelized cost of driving calculation. We present this data in a variety of different ways. The website itself, a downloadable Tableau workbook, formatted data sheets, as well as these presentation slides that will be available on OSTI and the website. So we hope that this package provides transparency, consistency, credibility, and accessibility across these important transportation data, and that you are able to readily use them for analysis and information. This, as I mentioned before, is a companion product to an electricity ATB that's also available on the same website under that electricity tab column. And that electricity ATB similarly is used as model inputs for analyses by a variety of external users. So if you have an interest on the electricity side, you may wish to check out that companion product. So now I'll turn to the website itself. I'm going to be presenting screenshots of the website first, and then time permitting, I'll do an actual live demo of the site. So when you first dive into the transportation area of the ATB, you'll see that we've added several top-level sections that cover the new areas of data. Importantly, the medium and heavy-duty vehicles section is now provided, and we also have a page about aviation. So from the top level, those are the options under the technology. And I'll also call to attention that in the About section, there are a lot of important definitions, as well as a consolidation of all the references. This data part of the navigation is where all of the downloads occur, as well as where you can visualize all of the data that's used elsewhere in the website. The data is parsed out into the specific topics, but all of the data is available for both download and visualization from the data page. So we'll dive into the fuels part first, and I'll orient you to the navigation around the fuels. Within the fuels area, there's 4 options. On-road fuels, so that's what you would put into a vehicle. Blend stocks, which are the subcomponents that go into the on-road fuels, as well as aviation and marine fuel sections. Previously, we had a combined section that included both blend stocks and on-road fuels, but for clarity, we have separated that out. And then diving into the on-road fuels, there are these 5 categories: gasoline and ethanol, petroleum and bio-based diesel fuel, natural gas, electricity, and hydrogen. So a separate page for each of the fuels. Within those fuel pages, you'll notice that we've kind of categorized the data sets in terms of whether they represent market or modeled data, and also whether they represent kind of a current volume, a high volume, or a low volume case, and then future versus current scenarios. So this text on this slide is directly from the definitions page of the ATB that defines what each of these scenario types mean. And one thing that you'll notice is that the fuels scenarios are static in time. So they are snapshots, they are not trajectories. And so that's why this current versus future distinction is important. And that feature of the scenarios is important to remember when interpreting charts that use the fuels for vehicles. So within each of the fuels pages for the on-road fuels, you'll see different types of charts that are available. And the drop-down menus that are shown here enable you to navigate to specific types of data. So these are just kind of snapshots of the navigation for each of these on-road types of fuels. And I'll jump over to the website itself momentarily. The fuels side of things also includes sustainable aviation fuels, and with a focus on the ethanol to jet, Fischer-Tropsch, and HEFA as the pathways that are shown. So similar to the on-road fuels, the navigation enables you to select the metric that you want to look at, as well as the fuel pathway and the characteristics of the LCA assumptions for the life cycle assessment of emissions. So kind of diving into these charts, this is an example of the charts that you'll see for on the fuels pages. So these are tables with either emissions characteristics if you've selected the emissions metric, or price characteristics if you've selected the price metric in the table, and then you can navigate to the specific class of vehicle that the fuel is intended for, that adjusts some of the assumptions. So these charts can be interactive for you to explore all of the data based on the selection in these radial buttons and drop-down menus at the top. So now I'll switch gears to dive into the vehicle technologies. And we have separate pages for both the light duty vehicles and the medium and heavy duty vehicles. Again, we have definitions of the scenarios. These scenarios are different from the ones on the fuel side. So where the fuel side has snapshots in time for either current or future market or modeled, low volume or high volume, these scenarios on the vehicle side are trajectories over time for advanced, mid, and constant. And what's varying there is the level of optimism about technology advancement over the time period. So we have light duty vehicles and medium and heavy duty vehicles. Within light duty vehicles, we have gasoline, diesel, natural gas, gasoline hybrid, plug-in hybrid, battery electric, fuel cell. And then we do have a page where you can compare across the different powertrains. So as an example, on the light duty vehicle side, we have charts like this that show the fuel economy in one chart and the modeled vehicle price in the same chart, but with a different selection of the radial button. And then you can use the drop-down menus to select the class, the powertrain, and the details of each powertrain. In the previous ATB, we just had mid-sized passenger cars, but now as you select from the drop-down menu, you'll be able to select other classes of light-duty vehicles. And as you can see, these scenarios are time series over the course of the years up to 2050, and the advanced case in the green will achieve more advanced technology improvements than the mid and constant cases. There's important watermark notes and notes under the figures, as well as a full section on key assumptions that go into the data on the pages. So a second type of chart that is on the vehicle pages combines levelized cost of driving and carbon dioxide emissions. And these are together because these metrics draw on both the vehicle assumptions as well as the input fuel assumptions. And so this chart is a little bit complicated, but I'll walk through it and hopefully it will then become clear. So because the chart is based on both vehicle and fuel data, we have this side chart that's this big green bar shows the full range of characteristics of fuels that can go into that vehicle. And then this black line shows where the particular selection falls within that range. And on the vehicles pages, we have simplified the choices to include only three: the baseline, the lowest carbon dioxide emissions, and the lowest cost. The comparison page and the comparison page and the full Tableau workbook on the data page include additional pathways. So one challenge with this visualization is that you may not be able to navigate to the full range that's shown on the vehicle pages, but if you go to the full comparison page, then you can select those. So it's important to keep in mind that these charts are drawing from both vehicle and fuel data, and that you can get different results by making different selections within that choice. The full Tableau workbook on the data page has lots and lots of options, and it can get confusing to navigate. And that's why we've offered simpler options here. And I'll be happy to answer any questions that folks have about interacting with this chart during the Q&A session. So just to summarize, not all the fuel pathways are available in this simplified view. So you can see the data or the fuels pages for the full set of fuels that are provided. And then the green bar is the range for whatever metric you're displaying for all of the pathways that go into that vehicle. Then the black bar shows which one has been selected. And again, these fuel data are snapshots in time. So even though the time series is shown in these vehicle charts, that whole range over time is varying only due to the vehicle characteristics. The fuel characteristics going in are constant. This slide shows an example of how the light-duty vehicle comparison page can look. So on that page, you're able to select among different powertrains and then compare them directly for whichever metric you have chosen. On the medium and heavy-duty vehicle side of things, it's the same kind of structure. Medium and heavy-duty vehicles are new, but we're using the same sorts of charts. And here we have the diesel hybrid, plug-in hybrid, battery electric, fuel cell, and then an opportunity to compare. And with the main metrics shown here as similar to the light-duty side of things. So this chart is structured the same as on the light-duty side. But here you can select among the medium and heavy-duty classes and powertrains. The metrics similarly are a choice here between fuel economy and modeled vehicle price for these charts that show metrics associated with vehicles. And then similar to the light-duty, the medium and heavy-duty vehicle also has these combination charts that combine data from fuels and vehicles. The one twist here that's different is that because there is a lot of uncertainty about refueling, particularly for fuel cell electric vehicles and for battery electric vehicles, we're showing a range that's based on the range of potential refueling or recharging costs for those vehicles. And that uncertainty is really in two bins. One is that there's uncertainty about what the costs will actually be. The other is that these vehicles encompass a really wide variety of duty cycles and usage circumstances. And so the charging and refueling costs for a given size class may still vary a lot depending on what those characteristics are. So that's the reason for this range. The range is shown, it's coming from the refueling and recharging. So it's shown in the fuel price, that's the delivered price to the vehicle. And the assumptions surrounding that can be explored in ATB, and questions are welcome about this as well. So there is a table that shows which specific pathways for fuels are chosen in these vehicle charts to represent the simplified set of options, baseline, lowest cost, and lowest emissions. And so you can trace back to which assumptions are used for which of those options. This just shows the different ways that the data is displayed on the website. So you can see it either within the pages for each of the powertrains, or in the big Tableau workbook on the data page, that has, all of the data options there as well. So, and there you can select from some of the other fuel pathways that aren't shown on the technology vehicle powertrain page itself. And then in the comparison page, you can also see comparisons across the different vehicles in each of the size classes. So there's a comparison page for light duty and then this comparison page for medium and heavy duty vehicles. A bunch of other important sections of the ATB are shown here. So within the About pages, there's just a wealth of information about the definitions and data sources and assumptions that are going into this, acronyms and references as well. So I encourage everyone to take a close look at the About pages if you have detailed questions. And then each web page has a summary of definitions that are used on that web page, as well as key assumptions, as well as references that are used on each of the technology pages. So that's kind of an orientation to the overall structure. And then in the data downloads area, we have the options to download the Excel file or a Tableau workbook. And then this presentation is getting posted there as well. This is kind of the detailed view of the menu driving the Tableau workbook. As you can see, you can select the metric, so fuel economy, levelized cost of driving, emissions, modeled vehicle price, etc. You can select between light duty and medium and heavy duty, all of the powertrains. It is, there's not always full like restrictions on logical combinations of these things. So if you select a light duty vehicle and then a powertrain that's only associated with a medium and heavy duty vehicle, you might end up with nothing. So if you end up with nothing in this view, you'll just want to verify that your selections are consistent with each other. So the vehicle scenario gives the constant, mid, and advanced cases, classes of vehicles, powertrain details for things like range, and then primary and secondary fuel pathway will get you into the large variety of fuel pathways beyond that baseline lowest cost and lowest emissions. So at this point, if there are questions from the chat, Daniela or others, I'd be happy to pose those. I'm going to switch my screen share and go over to the website itself and just kind of show a little bit of how the interaction looks there. Any questions about the website from the chat? And please feel free to.
We have one question that asks, can we generate different data within the web page by inputting our assumptions on cost, range, etc.?
Yeah, so the transportation ATB doesn't provide those capabilities. You can download the Excel file and then, use that as input to calculations and change inputs. On the electricity side of things, we have an Excel file that includes calculations, and we also have a corresponding Python package that provides all of those calculations programmatically, so that folks could take either of those, either the Excel file or the Python package, and modify them as they see fit. So those capabilities are something that we could consider, and certainly, if you have a recommendation on a specific type of calculation that you would like to be able to do, or just a vote that you'd like to have access to the calculations that we're using directly, that would be very welcome feedback. We do provide in our definitions specific documentation of all of the calculations that we're doing. And let's see. Are folks seeing my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the definitions page. As you can see, there's a lot of information about things. Oh, I guess maybe the calculation is over on the actual page. Nope, here we go. So here's an example of a documentation of a calculation that we're doing. So unfortunately, at this time, you would need to set that up yourself, but that is feedback that we would welcome if that's something that would be useful to users. Was there any other questions?
There was another web-based question, but in reference to, I guess, the electricity ATB asking to find the Python package on the website and whether we could provide a link to that or show where it is.
Yeah. So that's just over here in the data downloads. It's this ATB calc GitHub repo. And then we do have a recording of a webinar to orient folks to that. So
I was going to say the rest are content specific, so you can go ahead with the website and then we can revisit those.
Okay. Yeah, so kind of like the overview that I provided from the slides, but in more interactive mode. You can dial so that
I think we're experiencing a bit of audio issues on your end. Just one moment.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Now I can, yes.
Okay. To having other questions.
I think we're.
But in this case, you will set the vehicle metrics for fuel economy and modeled vehicle price, where you can toggle between them, and also select from the drop-down menus. And then the other chart that we also discussed in the presentation is the one that combines the vehicle and fuel metrics. So here you can look at either levelized cost of driving or emissions. And then also select among fuel pathways, vehicle scenarios, class, and powertrain details if there are some there. So that's just a quick overview of the vehicles pages. And then on the fuels side of things, we have the different fuels, diving in. That's the scenario definition. And then you can go into particular fuels areas and see the tables with the characteristics of the fuels, controlling what you see by the menus. So at this point, I would like to kind of switch gears and jump over to some Q&A. So please put your questions in the chat. And Daniela, did you have a starting point?
Yeah, I have a few we could ask. Also, your audio did cut out a little bit during the vehicles pages part. I don't know if you want to just like click on that one again, just to a brief summary of what you mentioned when you were going over the vehicles pages.
Okay, sure. So on the vehicles pages, as I discussed before, there's a page for light duty and another page for medium and heavy duty with specific pages for each of the powertrains. So you can dive into those. And then it's centered around these two chart types. One for the vehicle metrics that shows fuel economy and modeled vehicle price that can be controlled with the radial buttons and the drop-down menus to select the metric, the class, the powertrain, and any sub details on that. And then the other chart with the combined vehicle and fuel metrics, levelized cost of driving, and carbon dioxide emissions that rely on inputs from both the vehicle and the fuel. And similarly there, you can select the options with the radial buttons and the drop-down menus that you want to see, the classes, powertrain details, vehicle scenario, fuel pathway, and metrics. Okay, so let's turn to Q&A now.
Perfect.
Yeah,
I can ask a few. This one says, do you plan to include estimates for sustainable aviation synfuels made from hydrogen from electrolysis and CO2 from direct air capture in the future?
Yeah, so with each update, we assess what fuels we can include. Those are both likely candidates, but we kind of have to go through our review and decision process in terms of what we can take on in any given update. So sorry that that's not a more definitive answer, but that's kind of where we're at. But those are certainly of interest and likely candidates for consideration.
Awesome. Another one says, are you considering full scope and long-term marginal emissions? What sort of data would help create an even more accurate picture?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I would like to bring on one of our GREET experts to address that question. So let's see, I guess I'm not seeing who's online. I think Wee Sung, are you willing to field that and come on screen and if you're able and answer that one?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So the question may be on the electricity, I guess, right? Can the person confirm what the emission, the marginal emission actually means? Because currently the emissions that we include is the life cycle emissions of all the fuels and then electricity and hydrogen. So it's consistent with the grid, the scope of the emission accounting. But I'm not quite sure about the long-term marginal emissions that the person asked us about.
Great. If the user who asked about that wants to submit a follow-up question to clarify the long-term marginal emissions, then Wee-Sung can follow up and answer.
Yeah, I think I see the electricity and the scope 1 to 3. So for now, it's up to, I think, Laura and the team, whether we want to expand the emissions to cover scope 1 to 3 emissions for the electricity or other things. But for now, it's about the life cycle emissions. But for the plans for the ATB, it's up to the team, I'm sure.
And maybe for everyone's benefit, do you want to define the different scopes?
Okay, so this is Anga. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so on the marginal emission question, this will require grid modeling to know which unit will be dispatched for a marginal load, right? And if you do that, which will be very unique to each region, to each time frame, to how many vehicles you deploy, right? So to decide how much electricity, which unit will be dispatched, and all of that is somewhat uncertain, can be modeled, but very tedious, number one. And number two, it will be hard to justify why to use a marginal emission only for EVs and not use it for others, for example. So this is why we shy away from marginal emissions. It can be done, but as you go through electrification of different loads, buildings, vehicles, industry, among others, which one is in the margin, which one is in the average, will be tricky. So this is the answer for that. The other question was on what? Remind me, there was a follow-up question.
He submitted a follow-up question. Do you think a lack of full emission scope gives electricity a favorable outlook?
Yes. Okay, emission scopes. So scope 1, 2, 3. So usually these are from organization perspective that you could look at emissions. You say this is scope 1, this is scope 2, this is scope 3, right? Scope 1 is within my facility boundary, scope 2 is electricity, and scope 3 is everything else. In grid, we do not do that. We try to do that, but we shied away again from that because it is good from, again, organization reporting perspective to understand their footprint versus what they source. From a life cycle in general, we try to split it into two, basically direct facility emissions, scope 1, and then scope 2 and 3 are lumped together. We can always disaggregate scope 2 from 3. But again, if this is needed, we can do it for that purpose. But again, it will be tricky to dissect the life cycle emission into scope 2 and the 3 in particular, because the scope 2 will be strictly the power generation emissions or the steam. It is a utility, basically, you purchase, and then you will have to account for the supply chain to these. So it can be done if needed and if it is deemed important, but usually this is important only from organization perspective.
Super. Thank you so much, Amgad. And I think the other aspect that's this question highlights that's really important is that ATB is a kind of a summary entry point to a whole lot of data and information, but ATB in and of itself is not kind of a full analysis like a scenario analysis of everything that you might want to know about many of those items. So the kind of analysis that Amgad was talking about might take ATB inputs or share ATB inputs, but there's certainly a lot more beyond ATB. So I think it's important, as you approach ATB to be very aware of what it is and what it isn't. And this is a great example of one of the places where ATB just provides kind of an entry point and an initial summary around the emissions, but there's much, much more detail and ranges and understanding that could be gleaned from a more comprehensive analysis. Daniela, I'm thinking of running through quickly the open questions, and then maybe everybody who has answered a question, our panelists who've answered a question, if you would like to raise any of those that seem important. So the first one I'm seeing on the open questions is, can you please explain the reasoning for not projecting future fuel costs as compared to the vehicle costs, which you do project? So that's really based on the type of information that we have about fuels, and the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty about adoption rate and a lot of interdependence of the fuel prices with the adoption and the learning that might happen and the infrastructures that might be needed and kind of those whole systems. So, and we do have under consideration methodologies to apply those snapshots in time along with those other considerations to produce the full series trajectory, but we haven't done that yet. It looks like there's some problems with my display.
It was just showing the slides as opposed to the presentation mode. So you can reshare if you want to have presentation mode back.
Sorry.
No worries.
Good to go?
You'll have to reshare.
Oh,
Yeah, I turned it off to be safe, but
I don't, maybe I'll just
it's fine.
run through the questions and then, okay. How often do you update the predictions? That's really dependent on our data availability, staff availability, review timing. So we do have the word annual in the annual technology baseline name. We do update the electricity projections every year and have that down to a system. I think that on the transportation side, this is our second update and we're still trying to figure out what the appropriate cadence will be for the assumptions. And could you run scenarios based on assumptions you provide? Yes, the intention is that these assumptions are intended to contribute to scenario analysis for vehicles and fuel assumptions that may be part of transportation sectoral modeling analysis or economy-wide modeling analysis. That is the intent. Of course, any analyst will want to make their own judgments about the assumptions that we offer here, and certainly may need to adjust depending on the objectives of the study. Okay, how can propane get more representation in this data? And where would a DME blend fit into this data? So I think this kind of goes back to the fact that, as we set out to do an update, we need to review all of the fuels and all of the vehicles and the data that's available and the priorities and our role as expressing our understanding of technology R&D. And so all those considerations go in. Both of those fuels could be added. I think, there's just always questions about how many to do and what the priorities are. Okay. Question on comparison of BEVs with solar PV and a stationary battery providing charging electricity. With diesel at expected prices. Okay, so one of the electricity options is a dedicated renewables option. And I think it is based on solar PV. So if the person asking that question has trouble identifying that in the data, please reach out. But I do think that data is there. Okay, aviation fuels with battery electric solar PV skinned aircraft. We do not have battery electric aircraft at this time. Some of those emerging technologies for aircraft are certainly of great interest, but that's not something that we have in scope right now. My apologies. Okay, so here's a question about cambium data. So the cambium data set is over on the electricity side of things. On the NREL website, if you search on cambium, it should come up. That is certainly a source of long-term marginal emissions for the electricity sector scenarios that have been analyzed in the NREL regional deployment system model. There are, certainly others that would be based on other electricity sector capacity expansion scenarios. And if more information is needed, we can dive into that offline. At this point, I'd like to open the floor to other panelists who want to address any of the answers that have already been answered online. If folks would like to voice those answers and bring them to the attention of the full group, that would be welcome. So any of the panelists like to come on camera and highlight some of the discussion that has already been addressed in the chat?
Looks like you got to most of them.
Okay. Well, maybe I will just wrap up briefly. Are you folks seeing my presentation screen again?
Yes.
Okay. So I wanted to thank everyone for joining today, and just be sure that you are all aware, if you would like to receive notices of future updates, both to the transportation and the electricity ATB, either one. There is a link to register. We will not contact you very frequently. It would be more like maybe 4 times a year that something gets updated. And if you register, you'll always be in the know about events on the ATB front. Like to acknowledge our sponsors at the U.S. Department of Energy across the Sustainable Transportation offices, as well as the Strategic Analysis Office. And want to thank all of the panelists and all of the attendees. Really appreciate the opportunity and hope that this resource will be useful to you. Please don't hesitate to pose any questions on the ATB question link, and look forward to the next update and providing this information on an ongoing basis. So thanks so much. And with that, I think our ATB update webinar is concluded.